And the topic of my message is really about amplifying our voice, because when we're dealing with chaos, when we're dealing in crisis and everybody is on high alert, that means that it's really hard to be heard. So I'm going to share with you today some strategies about how to be heard amidst the chaos. And when you think about the term amplify, what does that even mean? It means to get louder, turn up the volume, but it's also more than that. It can mean to build intensity. And that's really what I'm talking about, to be thoughtful, to be strategic, and to gather cheerleaders so that others want to join us in the effort. And they can only do that if they know where we're going. So we have to be clear on that. Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State, has a quote. She said, "It took me quite a long time to develop a voice. And now that I have it, I am not going to be silent." So I can think of times when I had a voice, when I spoke up for a project, when I had an idea and I brought it to people and we accomplished something really meaningful. And I can also think of times when I struggled to find my voice, when I was afraid, or I wasn't sure how to explain what I thought needed to be done, or I was concerned about judgment. Or sometimes I didn't think it was my place. Now, maybe that's because of the generation I grew up in, where I was frequently the only woman in an overwhelmingly male environment, and the only woman at the table if I was at the table. But eventually what I saw was that there was risk in not speaking up. There was risk in not putting forth an idea, in not showing the way. And I think once I understood that I had an obligation to speak up, not just for myself professionally, but for the people that I served. Particularly now, I really believe that silence is, it's a luxury we can't afford. So I'm excited to talk to you about how to stand up for what must be said. And it's beyond getting clear, getting attention in a meeting, right? Although it could be that, but how do we stand up for what we said? To me, there are really three things that this involves. It involves consideration of specific strategies that support and empower our position. It involves also thinking about who and what is this going to impact. And Golby spoke to this so clearly, because everybody's on high alert. Everybody's looking at things from a different perspective. And that's an important thing to consider if you want to be heard. And then also, how do we attune our voice to this environment so that we can be heard? This is a really important topic for me. There was a time when I was really trying to get things done. I was really trying to have an impact. I was trying to change a culture. And I just found that I was having trouble getting people's attention. And at the time, I was working with a guy who had become a really dear friend. And he was obviously a rising star. We were paired on a couple of projects, and he just seemed to raise an idea, and all of a sudden he had the money and the staff and the funding, and people were behind him. And I watched that, and I couldn't help but notice that ideas and suggestions, proposals, it seemed like as soon as I spoke them aloud, they would die a quick death. And I feel like, as I considered that, my initial instinct was, well, maybe I just have lousy ideas, or maybe people like him better than me. He was a likable guy. But fortunately, I didn't sit there too long. I decided to ask him. And I was really lucky that my friend John had a very generous spirit. And it turned out that the reason my ideas weren't flying, my voice wasn't being heard. The reason my voice wasn't being heard was because I was missing a few key steps that he was spending a lot of time on. So it turns out that it wasn't a popularity contest, and it didn't really have anything to do with caliber of my ideas. I'm going to share with you what John taught me. And what he said was that if there is something really important, it's really important to you, something that costs money, something that is going to change people's lives, or perhaps mean that a business aspect change. And maybe some people will have more influence, and maybe some people, if your idea gets implemented, their influence will diminish. Whatever's important. And of course, I'm speaking now mostly about a work context, but I would say that the same thing is true if there's something you really want to see change in a meaningful relationship or in your household, that you really can benefit from pursuing the 5 steps that I've put here, that I sort of came to understand as I practiced more with the idea of being strategic before I opened my mouth. So first, you want to do an initial assessment. And that is to really think clearly about what this idea or proposal might be. And then identify the barriers, the objections, the reasons why people wouldn't want to move forward with this. Know those in advance, know those going in. And then really building a team of cheerleaders, allies, advocates, people who want to engage with you on this. And especially in times of chaos, it's really hard to be a lone voice. Then carefully craft your message and choose your time. So imagine that you have a great idea. You know it is a game changer. You know it's going to solve problems. It could be one of those if only ideas that if only we could do this one thing, everyone's world would be better. You feel it in your gut, you know it. Now, your first instinct might be to get so excited about the idea that you just run it up the flagpole and see if it flies. And that was kind of me. That was my instinct early on in my career, where I would just be overwhelmed with enthusiasm, and I'd put together a proposal and I'd lay it on the table, and nothing. Instead of going full steam ahead, maybe what I should have done, definitely what I should have done, is what I'm going to suggest to you here. And that is to pause and gain clarity. Write the idea down. It may seem very simple, but just writing an idea down can help you find things that need more clarity. And then write down all the possible positive outcomes of your idea. What would be the best possible thing that could happen if this idea were implemented? Now, here's something that's very, very hard. I want to suggest that at this stage, at the early stage, we need to ignore the reasons why this might be a lousy idea, for a couple of reasons. First of all, you don't want to neg yourself out and risk the chance that you just won't raise the idea because there's some issues with it. That's not fair to you. It's not fair to the people who need to hear this idea. Also, there will be a point where other people will be happy to tell you what the flaws are in your idea, and you want to give them a chance to do that. So don't assume you know yet. And then imagine that it's a year from now, and everything you wanted to happen, that if only we could do this, has happened. Make a note of what has changed. That's going to keep you energized and excited about the idea, even in the face of the objections that are kind of inevitable whenever you are suggesting change. So then ask yourself, and this is tough, what don't I know? What don't I know, for me, I don't know about you, is a really scary question sometimes. And it's tempting to avoid it because it doesn't feel good and it feels overwhelming. The whole category of, I don't know this. But if you don't ask yourself this, you will set yourself up for failure, and you will lose an opportunity to gain advocates and champions for what you're trying to achieve. You really, really want to know and talk to the naysayers, the people who are going to be possibly impacted in a negative way. You want to learn from them and make adjustments and gain their support. And you can prepare yourself for this by for this kind of objection barrier scenario by making a list of questions up front. What do I need to know? What is this great idea going to cost? Everybody's going to ask that, whether it's somebody you live with or the business you work with. Everybody wants to know, what's it going to cost? Whose work is going to be directly impacted, positively or negatively? I can't stress what an important consideration this is. And especially on the positive side, if you know someone's going to be positively impacted by your idea, then they become a potential advocate for you. And that's a good thing to identify up front. What other business areas might need to be considered? What can you find out around the margins that you hadn't thought of ahead of time? And how long is this going to take to integrate? Whatever your list of questions is, this is a great transition to the next step, which really is using these questions as conversation starters to begin to build your advocates, some champions for you, people who are going to want to help you. So how do we do this? You know, this seems to be a big issue. When I was talking about doing this discussion today here, I was speaking with Lynn Evans, and we were chatting about how difficult it is to move from concept to execution. And in my experience, it is this piece of gaining advocates that's the critical piece. In fact, it was the key differentiator with my friend John when it came to getting his ideas out there. I would be the person who would write the detailed proposal. It was bulletproof. It was brilliant. I got all caught up in my own writing and my idea, and I stayed very much in a vacuum while John would throw out what seemed like an off-the-cuff concept, and all of a sudden, he's been given a green light, and I'm being ignored again. And he had been building allies all the time. As much effort and work as I had been putting into my proposals, he had been putting meticulous work into building his case. And this is really important stuff. He would also find out, as I mentioned, who's going to be positively impacted. He'd get them on board ahead of time. He would take his list of questions and bring them to people. Did they have answers? So that he could sort of address those objections and ID the barriers and maybe even come up with solutions to those barriers ahead of time. He'd ask people to poke holes in his thoughts so that he would be prepared to handle the objections when he got them. And he'd ask, what am I missing? Who else should I speak with? You know, it was really a leap of faith for me to try this approach. I kind of thought if I had a great idea and I made it really clear that people should just agree with me, it should be obvious. What I didn't understand was that engaging other folks in this process is a way of getting them vested in the outcome. Relationships are really sticky things. And if you ask people to help you, if you ask people for their advice, if you ask people, what do you think? They're going to begin to want to go with you there because they are a part of the solution. You've made them a part of the process. And, you know, what I found out also that was really quite a help is that these 5 steps, you don't need to do them alone. When John and I realized we had a good thing going, we would get together and tag team on some mission we had. And each of us would take the piece that we were best at and we'd run with it. And the cool thing about that was that overnight we had 100% more support for whatever our idea was, which was not only efficient, it was also great not to be going at it alone and not to have to do all of that work. Does this take trust? It absolutely does. It absolutely does. But as I said, there's a psychology behind this. In fact, I'd recommend Robert Cialdini's book, Influence. He goes into detail on what the psychology of asking people for help is, and why it's such an effective way to build coalitions so that you can be heard. You know, especially in times of crisis, it's really hard to be heard over the din. And this is an approach that has worked for me, and I hope that it works for you. There are a few other things that you do want to consider. Timing, obviously, as I mentioned at the beginning. Also the how and where of introducing your proposal. And I'd encourage you to consider who's the best person to carry your message. It may not always be you. Another thing I want to mention is that, you know, I used to think that if nothing happened when I had an idea, I used to get this voice in my head that would say, they're just not listening. And I realized a long time ago that that became a cue for, no, they haven't bought in. And that's on me. So then I'd ask more questions, learn more, and I rarely gave up. I would often raise the same idea, the same thing several times and find great success once I'd learned more and listened more. And sometimes a no isn't a no, it's not yet. So I'd encourage you to think about that as well. And with that, I'd ask, what's keeping you from using your voice, and how can I help? How can we help? I really welcome your questions and invite you to let me know. If you'd like to connect with me on LinkedIn, go ahead, and excited to continue the conversation.